development. But yes, I'll briefly introduce Anna first, and then she can give her presentation. Anna Thomset is a researcher at the Bayer Institute of Ecological Studies, an affiliated researcher at the Institute for International Economic Studies, and an assistant professor in the economics department at the University of Stockholm. Originally, she's trained as a civil and environmental engineer, but she received her PhD in sustainable development from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Her experience spans Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and her research focuses on how public goods shape human development and societies, and how communities and organizations can best provide public goods. Without further ado, Anna.
Is this like a leap of faith?
I think so.
Is this okay? So I guess I can just say that this is going to be very much a change of scale from what we've been thinking about in the morning. So this morning we've been talking about global scale and like massive trillions of dollars of fundings. Here we're going to think about something that really zooms down to like an extremely narrow and local level. So we're going to talk about, this paper's called Time is Not Money. It's an experiment with community contribution requirements in cash and labor. And so this is joint work with my former graduate student, Serena Coccolo, who's now at the bank in the governance practice, Selene Gazolfi, who's an assistant professor in Milan, and my longtime colleague and co-author, Mohammed Hassan Habib, who's at NGO Forum for Public Health in Bangladesh, but who just finished his PhD at KTH in Sweden in January. Okay. So this is, I wasn't sure if this was a cheeky slide to put up, but in this audience, but I put it up anyway. So this was from an excerpt from a wonderful report that two World Bank economists wrote back in 2013. And at the time, they were talking about this movement in development towards participatory development. And there was this idea that top-down approaches to development had limited success. And so instead, what we needed to do was move to a more bottom-up, like community-driven approach to development. And there was this huge trend towards this. That in 2013 they estimated that the World Bank had spent about $85 billion on this model of development, and they said at the time that this process of moving towards participatory approaches was more driven by ideology and optimism than by systematic analysis. And so a lot of the work that I and my colleagues have been doing in the past 10 years has been about trying to fill in this gap. We were speaking last night about the lag time between researchers giving answers to policy questions. So they wrote this in 2013. Here I am in 2024. Bear with us is the message. And so today, this is kind of a big picture thing about a specific approach to development. And here I'm going to narrowly focus on community contribution requirements. And so this is the idea that when you run a project in a local community, you should ask communities to contribute to the project, whether it's in cash or in labor or in kind. And when these things are not kind of well documented, but if this review by White et al. In 2018 reviewed, I think, 23 projects across 21 countries, and in every single one they had this kind of requirement. So this is something that's actually very universally imposed. I just have to be more patient. So why do we do this? Okay. So everyone, obviously people are doing this, they're not crazy. They have some ideas in mind when they impose such a requirement. So one of the things that you want to do when you put on a contribution requirement, you have this idea that maybe there are communities who just really aren't interested in this project, and by putting a sort of nominal price on it, you're going to screen out the ones who are not interested. There are these kind of more behavioral ideas that are like sort of less well, they're a little less well defined, but there's this idea that if someone pays something towards it, they're going to have a sense of ownership over the asset that we're talking about, whether it's a well or an earthen road or some kind of local asset. And the idea is that if I have a sense of ownership over it, I'm going to engage more actively in kind of managing and operating and maintaining it. There's a second idea, which is very closely related. It's like a sunk cost hypothesis. Once you've spent money on something, then you experience a cognitive cost if you don't use it. Like it bugs you if you pay for something and then you don't use it. And so there's this idea that if you've paid something towards it, maybe you're more likely to use it in the future. And then, I put it last, but maybe it should be first. There's this fundamental idea that this is about efficiency, right? We talked a lot about scarce resources, and you want to allocate them most efficiently. And if you can leverage some of the community's resources alongside your own resources, the idea is that you can take your scarce resources and make them go further across more communities.
So just aim over here.
Over here, okay.
Yeah.
Or there, okay. And the things that people worry about a lot about community contributions is that maybe you're not screening out people who don't want it or not interested in it. Maybe you're just screening out people who can't afford the contribution requirement. And then there's some sense in which, our overarching goal often in these projects is to alleviate poverty. And there is a little bit of a tension that you're walking into a community of very poor people and you're sort of asking them to allocate some of their scarce resources towards your project when, we know that they have many other competing needs, demands on their resources. So people have written a lot in economics about, what happens when you just put a price on a good. So, for example, there's a very interesting literature from a few years back about, how much more efficient it is to give out bed nets for free versus putting a price on bed nets. But so what we're going to study is not just a price; it's a collective contribution requirement. So it's not just saying, okay, you need to pay me some nominal price for this bed net if you want it. It's saying approaching a whole group of people and saying, if you collectively want a well for your community, you need to collectively contribute towards it. And so why is that different? One, we know whenever a bunch of people have to coordinate to do something, that can be costly. There are costs, time costs and energy costs associated with coordination. And then, economists think a lot about this idea of a free rider problem, Like, if someone's got to pay for something, but then we can all use it, then many people's ideal scenario is that somebody else pays the cost and I get to use it without having contributed. And so there's a temptation to free ride on other people contributing, which makes it harder to raise those kind of contributions. And then one thing that we worried about a lot when we first worked on this, when we first designed this study, is this idea that if you're asking people to contribute and people differ in their ability to contribute, then possibly the people who have most money are going to have most influence of the decisions. And I think everybody's probably been in a meeting where somebody has the deepest pockets in the meeting and, they probably get outsized influence over what to say. Usually I can make a joke about who that is, but maybe it's Stefan, I don't know. And then we're going to compare cash versus labor. And so these are two alternatives. They're both commonly implemented. One is you ask a group of people to contribute in cash, and the other one is that you ask a bunch of people to somehow meet a labor contribution requirement. And what's the difference between these two? Okay, there we go. So a lot of the previous literature, there's very interesting descriptive literature that kind of talks about experience with particular projects. And the main thing people worried about was distributional consequences. And what I mean by distributional consequences was who benefits and who pays the cost. And so people worried a lot that if it was, cash, you were going to exclude poorer communities or poorer groups within communities, and that because the rich typically have more ability to pay than the poor, that you would essentially be transferring influence towards the rich. And then the big worry with labor contribution requirements is that they're regressively borne by the poor. Because typically, who turns up to actually do the labor after that meeting where the richest guy gets to take the decisions? It's the sort of bottom of the food chain. I don't know if there are any grad students here, but that's usually you in an academic context. So these are the things that people worried about a lot in the past. And so what we're going to do is, but those distributional consequences might not be the end of the story. Like they could matter in sort of ways in terms of average impact, in terms of average take-up as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask the question of how requiring targeted beneficiary communities to contribute collectively in cash or labor affects the average impact and the distribution of costs and benefits in projects to provide safe community wells in rural Bangladesh. And I warned you we were like radically changing scale here. Now we're talking about building a 1 or 2 wells in a community of 50 to 250 households in northern Bangladesh. Okay, so what is the problem? Why don't we have, people have written a lot about this in the past. Why don't we have good evidence on this? The problem is that in general, if you just try and compare things that people have done in the world in the past, different implementing organizations choose different policies. They choose different policies in different communities and for different projects. And if you try and just compare communities with this projects with this kind of requirement to projects without this kind of requirement, there's a lot of other things going on that make it difficult to say anything causal about the differences between the two. So what we're going to do in this study is we're actually going to implement a program of interventions designed to increase access to safe drinking water. There's going to be 171 communities in our study, and 129 of them are going to be randomly assigned to receive the program. The program consists of subsidies and technical advice for safe drinking water wells. And we're going to, within those treated communities who are randomly assigned to get treatment, we're going to randomly assign them to one of 3 contribution models. And the first one is going to be asking people to contribute in cash. Now, this is actually the status quo in Bangladesh. So talking about how universal these requirements are, it is official national policy in Bangladesh that communities should contribute 10 to 15% of the cost of any new water or sanitation infrastructure. And that applies blanket across communities, regardless of the poverty level of the community. So the status quo is that you contribute about 10 or 15% of the project cost in cash. Our second treatment arm is a labor contribution requirement, which is basically, it has the same value as the cash contribution if you price people's labor and time at the unskilled daily wage. And then in the third treatment arm, we're going to offer the project without requiring any particular contribution requirement. And I should say, please, we're a small, friendly group here. If you need any clarifications, please just jump in and we can sort them out as we go. Yes, please.
Hire somebody to work for you?
So we didn't stop them from doing it. I think afterwards, about 6% of people, respondents in the whole survey, said that somebody paid said that it happened in their village. So I think it happened a little bit, but maybe less than you might think.
Would that be a problem?
Not particularly. Like we asked them to provide labor contributions, and then in general, if you say they can't do it, they can still do it and then not tell you about it. So we would have rather have had them do it and let us know. But in practice, it didn't seem to happen very much. So what we do that's new, and I'm not going to talk much about what other people have done, but just so you get a sense of why this is kind of interesting, is that this is the first time that people have provided experimental evidence on the effects of a collective contribution requirement for a development intervention, and the first time that people have made this experimental comparison between cash and labor. Okay, so how many people know about the arsenic pollution problem in Bangladesh? You must. Mashfiq, if you work with Mashfiq, you must know about this. Okay, but just very briefly, so this has been called the largest poisoning of a population in history. It's a problem at kind of extraordinary scale. In 2013, just before we started this project, there were about 40 million people across Bangladesh drinking water with arsenic above the WHO standard. It's a completely naturally occurring problem. There's basically arsenic in the rocks in the Himalayas. It gets eroded and washed down in the rivers, down into the river delta in Bangladesh. When it lands in the river delta in Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is so low and flat, the rivers slow down, the arsenic in the water precipitates out, and then layers of sediment build up at the bottom of the river. Once the arsenic-containing sediment layers are cut off from oxygen, the arsenic gets released into the drinking water. And so you basically get this layer of arsenic-contaminated drinking water just in the shallow groundwater, essentially. Arsenic is a pretty noxious pollutant because you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. The only way to detect it in water is through a chemical test, which for many, many years was not readily available in Bangladesh. It's slightly better now. And it's also, it's a bioaccumulant, so you don't get sick immediately from drinking water with low arsenic contamination. Instead, it builds up in your body over like 10 to 15 years, and eventually, you start to get sick, and at that point, you realize that you have this accumulation of arsenic in your body that is, by then, essentially impossible to get rid of. And so, there was a big move in the 70s and 80s in Bangladesh because there was extraordinarily high rates of infant mortality from diarrheal disease. People were drinking surface water, and there was a big international push to get people to use wells instead, shallow tube wells. Nobody had tested the shallow groundwater for chemical contaminants, and because of these features of the arsenic problem, no one realized that this was going on for a couple of decades. And so in the 1990s, these cases of arsenic start to emerge, and people realize that there's this giant scale problem that's going on. And still, even 10 years down the line, I think there's been some improvement, but I think the latest numbers are still in the tens of millions of people who are drinking water contaminated with arsenic. On some level, there is a very, very simple technological solution, which is basically digging a well deeper. So all the arsenic is concentrated in the shallow groundwater. If you can dig deep enough, you can hit a layer of groundwater that's sort of tens of thousands of years old. if once the water's been in the ground for tens of thousands of years, everything is kind of filtered out of it. So the easy solution is you just dig deeper, but it costs quite a lot to do that. So it costs a lot more to dig a deep tube well compared to the kind of ubiquitous shallow tube wells. And the cost of installation, you know, it's about half of per capita GDP. So these are expensive assets. And so you really, if you're going to provide them, you really have to think about doing this in a community level. And they're really, and there's a video that I have no way of pressing the link, but if you're interested, I can show you it, which basically shows you how they do this. And it's really kind of extraordinary, but almost everything is done using manual labor, like human power. So what the intervention consists of is a package of technical advice and subsidies. We offer 1 or 2 safe drinking water wells. A community is going to be the unit that we're going to think about, and that's going to be a group of 50 to 250 households. That doesn't really line up neatly with like local administrative units. So what we do is we take the local administrative units and then we break them down along natural geographical boundaries to end up with a unit of about 50 to 250 households. And we do that because these kind of community projects involving community meetings are pretty hard to sustain in larger groups. And then the interventions that we implement in the treated communities are identical, except for the contribution rules that we implement. And under the cash contribution arm, we asked them to contribute about $72 collectively. And again, that's in line with national policy. That's about 10% of installation costs. The labor contribution requirement is specifically 18 person days of unskilled labor. And if you value that using the unskilled wage, that ends up being, you know, approximately equivalent in magnitude to the value to the cash contribution arm. And in the waiver treatment arm, we basically let people know that we were doing this as part of a research project. As a consequence, we had some extra funding that allowed us to waive this requirement in some communities. And in those communities, they didn't have to provide a cash or labor contribution. In practice, we still have to find a piece of land to install the well. So there's still some aspect in which communities have to contribute in some level, but that's constant across all the treatment arms. And just important piece of context, perhaps, is that all the decisions about the project are taken by consensus in community meetings. And we have a previous experiment where we show that this kind of yields better outcomes than other kind of decision-making models that you could think about. But so you should think about that as being part of the setup. So if you were asked to contribute cash, you had up to 12 weeks to raise the cash contributions. So we did that to give people time to, you know, there's several harvest seasons in Bangladesh to kind of try and avoid moments where people were particularly short of cash. If you were going to contribute labor, there's some level of coordination on the date that you provide labor, but it's very limited. In practice, what happens is the contractor rings you and says, I'm coming to install the well tomorrow, and you have to provide labor on the next day. So the contractor attempts installation if all the project requirements are met, including the contributions if they're required. So in principle, we sort of threatened to pull the plug on construction if they didn't provide labor contributions, because there's a sort of timing difference here, right? You have to provide labor during the process as opposed to cash, which you provide up front. So we threatened to pull the plug and stop construction if they didn't provide labor. In practice, that didn't happen. So once a project was started, people contributed. And so where we work, it's in the northern part of Bangladesh. Again, I'm not sure how much people know about this, but this is not right in the epicenter of the arsenic problem. But because it's relatively distant from the epicenter of the problem, very few people had come in and run interventions in the past. And so the NGO that I work with, they felt like there was going to be a lot of value to new interventions. The downside of this is sort of 9 months of Serena's life, which was that we had to kind of screen communities ourselves for arsenic contamination, because there's only limited baseline data available. So we looked at 200 communities who, you know, government's data suggested had an arsenic problem. We screened out 29 of them because they didn't have, our testing suggested that the arsenic problem was not very intense or extensive. 171 went forward to get randomized, and then we randomized them into these 4 treatment arms, so cash, labor, waiver, and a control group that didn't get any intervention through our project. And this is just to show you that the experiment worked in the sense that we get a nice balance across space of the different treatment arms. And so just timelines. So we started this project in 2015. It took us like a long time to collect baseline data because we collected a lot of baseline data about all the water sources in each community. We got a little bit of funding later on, so we added 16 villages in 2017. We ran interventions kind of sequentially throughout the communities between 2016 and 2018, and then we wrapped everything up with a follow-up survey. So we collected tons and tons of data. In the beginning of the survey, in the beginning of the study, we actually did a... Yes, please.
What's the main outcome you're interested in?
The main outcome is arsenic contamination. So our goal is to kind of look at, we have this randomized experiment. We look at the total impact of the project by testing water quality in the sources people use and in their drinking water. And the main outcome is exposure to arsenic. And then we also collected data on a bunch of secondary outcomes. And in the paper, we do a lot of work of trying to unpick what matters. Today, I'm just going to skip to telling you what matters. But there's more on that in the paper if you're interested.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Is exposure to arsenic changed because they're actually using the well that there's been introduced?
In this study, yeah, basically. It like lines up pretty linearly. Like the amount of water that you collect from the well lines up with the reduction in arsenic contamination. It's not obvious that that's the case. Like in a previous study, people kind of responded to a program like this by building their own wells. So, we would offer them one, and then they would agree between themselves that we will build another one here as well. And so we've seen that happen before, but in this case, I think all the evidence we have points to this really operating through use of our project wells.
People are equally informed about the impact of drinking water with arsenic?
People are very well informed in Bangladesh. So I don't know if anyone's worked in sort of West Bengal or parts of India, but there people are much less well informed. But in Bangladesh, this is a very highly publicized issue. I think we sort of, like 97, 98% of our sample, even more perhaps, have heard of arsenic before we intervene. So at baseline, we map every safe drink, every source in the community. Then we conduct a household survey in about 6,500 households. And then we merge these two things together to create a household water source panel, matched household water source panel data set. Sure. So most people are using shallow tube wells, of which a substantial share are contaminated by arsenic. Most people are using either a shallow tube well that belongs to their own household, or they're using one that belongs to a relative. So that's the status quo, and people actually have a very strong preference to use a private source, which I think is not an unreasonable preference to have, given the prevalence of private household water sources everywhere people can afford them. And so this is actually much trickier than it sounds, because if you want to match people to their wells, no one has a database on wells. That's partly why we mapped all the wells in the first place. And then we match people to wells, both using text descriptions. And then I have a ridiculous data set of 20,000 pictures of wells. So we showed people pictures of the wells and checked that they'd made the right choice. So I think we're pretty confident on our ability to construct this. And then we test for arsenic in both samples from wells and in household drinking water. I don't know if anyone's seen a field test before, but this is basically what it looks like. So it takes 20 minutes to get the test, and then whenever we test it for arsenic in all the water sources and households. We gave people the results right away. So, for ethical reasons, we certainly don't want to let anyone continue drinking arsenic in an uninformed way. And if you just look at the share, this is the communities in the study, of the share of wells at baseline that were contaminated above the WHO threshold. There's quite a lot of variance across our sample, but the average, I think, is about 60%. And if you look at the epidemiological literature and try and map this to health impacts, these contamination levels are equivalent to about another 3.6 people dying of cancer in each community, and the average community size is about 160 households. So this is a non-trivial health problem. There are many other health problems that people are dealing with, so you should think about it as being one of a number of problems. I'm not going to talk much about this, but my co-authors went nuts and collected data on everything that you can possibly imagine. I'm not sure I can analyze all this data in a lifetime, but we drew on lots of this to try and understand what goes on. Okay, so there's a lot of lines on this screen, so I hope you can see this. But this is a summary of the impacts. And so we basically aggregate information about exposure to arsenic across all the tests we have for a given household using an inverse covariance index. And on average, under either the waiver or labor treatment arm, the program's kind of modestly successful in reducing exposure to arsenic. The effects are about like 0.1, 0.11 standard deviations. Those are obviously kind of indistinguishable from one another. Under the cash treatment arm, the point estimate is actually positive. It probably doesn't worsen arsenic contamination, but you should think about that as really having a modest impact at best. What drives that? And again, in the paper, we unpick all the things that don't drive this, but I'm just giving you the headlines. What drives this result is community take-up. So community take-up is about 90-something% under the waiver and labor arms, and it plummets to 23% under the cash treatment arm. So why do people, what explains this take-up? So here we can kind of categorize every time it went wrong. You can see that, in a few cases there were technical reasons why we couldn't install a well. In a few cases, they can't find a suitable site within the community. There's a very tiny number of cases where they didn't hold a meeting or they couldn't take a decision. But the sort of all the action here is really coming from the fact that under the cash treatment arm, people didn't raise the contributions. And what that implies is that they showed up, they kind of agreed to engage in the project. They showed up to a meeting, sat for like 90 minutes and argued quite passionately about where the well was going to be. And then they just didn't manage to raise the contributions. So why didn't they raise the contributions? Or more precisely, why didn't they raise the cash contributions when they did raise the labor contribution? The primary answer to us is that, in rural areas, people don't value their time at the daily wage rate. And this is something that we actually know a lot about. This is something that's really well documented. So there's lots of like unemployment and underemployment in these rural villages. So if the value to people of their time is below the unskilled daily wage rate. So the real kind of cost to them of contributing was much lower for the labor contribution requirement than for the cash contribution requirement. And that's where how the title of the paper comes around. Yeah.
Are you saying that there's two effects then? So one is that they're less likely to build the well because they're less likely to get the contributions. And the second is even if they do build the well, they don't use it?
No.
Or there's the same thing?
No. The second, it doesn't happen at all. So conditional on building a well, people use it at almost exactly the same rates.
Got it, okay.
All the action is driven by this margin of whether the community builds a well or not. And then we also have some evidence that there's like more coordination costs for cash, although we can't really say for sure whether that's just because it's a more expensive contribution requirement or because it's specifically cash.
So I wonder why you focus on that explanation and not just simple credit constraint one.
So I think credit constraints are a part of this, right? Like, what is this telling you? It's telling you that the sort of utility value of cash is much higher than the utility value of time. But why is one of the reasons why the utility value, I'm sorry, I'm going into like econ jargon, but one of the reasons why cash is so valuable is because there are credit constraints. So I don't think that there is but then I am skeptical that, offering these on credit would help. Because the value of these wells, it is real and people have documented that it's substantial, but it's sort of invisible and it happens over 10 years. So it's a very long-term investment. And so people have shown that credit constraints make a lot of difference when you've got something that realizes a cash savings, like the Susanna Burkauer work on improved stoves. If it realizes a cash profit in a short term, then maybe credit makes a difference. I'm kind of skeptical that credit would fix this, but I can't speak to that.
Did you look at this at all as if you had charged half the amount?
Yes, and I can't press the button. But basically, we did do that. So as part of a follow-up study, we went back and we looked at and we offered people wells at differing prices as part of a kind of follow-up experiment. And then this statistic that we got here, the amount of cash that that yields the same response is around sort of 5% of the value of. It's a 5% of the cash contribution requirements. It's about 500 taka compared to 6,000 taka. If that's 5%, I'm not sure. I have this number in dollars and percent and taka, and sometimes I get mixed up. But it's basically a very small amount of cash, we estimate, would yield the same take-up response as the labor contribution requirement. Okay, so if we look really closely, and you probably can't here because the text is too small, but basically there's more selection. There's more screening under the cash contribution arm. So the people who have successfully raised cash have a bigger arsenic problem compared to the people who successfully raise labor or waiver. But we basically find no evidence that this is working as a screening mechanism. And the idea with a screening mechanism is that you're screening out the people who don't want it or don't need it or aren't going to benefit from it. But essentially we find the labor contribution requirement is not changing screening at all. And the cash contribution requirement, because take-up collapses, screening we'd have to be quadrupling impact in the treated villages for this to pay off, and we find no evidence that it's really increasing impact at all. Okay, I promised the slides are nearly done. Okay, so then the other main argument that we talked about was cost effectiveness. And so if we compare the amount that NGOs spent per successfully installed well on installation alone, so this is just the cost of building the well, then you see the cost advantage of asking for contributions, right? You can see that it costs more per well under waiver, whereas cash and labor, part of that is offset by the contribution requirements. But then we also kept track of what the NGOs spent on overheads, so on like staff time and office time, and we carefully account all of that to different communities. And then, so then the cash treatment arm is horrific in cost effectiveness terms because you waste tons of money going to all these villages which don't install wells. But more interestingly, I think, the amount of overheads you spend in the labor contribution requirement is higher than you spend under the waiver, and the additional amount is enough to offset the gains that you made by getting communities to contribute to the cost of building the well. And so actually the cost per successfully installed well is lowest under the waiver. This is just for the NGO, so this is just pure cash costs. We also care about the community's time. So when we add the community's time that they spend on the contributions, the cost effectiveness difference gets worse. If we also work out how much time the community spent on coordinating amongst themselves and attending meetings and engaging with this, the cost effectiveness gets even worse. Because again, they had to spend more time coordinating in the labor and cash treatment arms as well. And again, the cash just gets worse and worse because the community also wasted tons of time discussing wells that they weren't going to build. So if we just summarize that, then you can see that, if you look at the installation costs only, then it looks like there's an advantage to the cash and labor contributions, but that's kind of illusory. As soon as we build in these other costs that are important, it goes away. And actually the most cost-effective way to build wells is not to ask communities to contribute at all. So this, I probably don't have time to talk about, but just to say that we compared our households to the households in Bangladesh as a whole. You really have to get into the top wealth quintile in Bangladesh, to the wealthiest 20% of the people in Bangladesh, before you find households where half the households value their time at or above the daily wage. And then, the things that we worried about ex ante, all these distributional questions about who benefits, none of them turn out to be very important at all. What really drives the results is this community take-up question. So just to summarize, cash radically decreases take-up compared to waiver. Labor does not. Under the labor treatment arm, we reduce arsenic compared to the control group, not under the cash treatment arm. The impact is equal under labor and when we waive contributions, and the cash has a much lower impact on arsenic, and both of them decrease cost effectiveness, although the cash does so to a much greater extent because of all the lack of take-up. Okay, so if you're going to require communities to contribute, I think there's a strong argument that requiring poor rural communities to contribute in labor rather than cash is better. It increases welfare. It's better for everyone. So they're contributing to you, and they value that time at a relatively low level. In our study, it looks like this is probably true in most of Bangladesh, especially in rural Bangladesh. There's lots of other studies that describe this phenomenon elsewhere. So we think in poor rural communities, this is probably something that's quite generalizable. I'm pretty sure that as you get richer, judging by how hard it is to get people to show up, rich people to show up for meetings versus how hard it is to get them to, like swish is what it's called in Sweden, like 10 bucks for something. I'm pretty sure the advantages reverse as incomes grow, or in places like urban informal settlements where time is extremely scarce. So if it's feasible, you might want to consider requiring labor contributions rather than cash. Should we do this at all? It's unclear. Like the cash contribution requirement worsens outcomes by most measures. The labor contribution requirements don't harm outcomes, but they also don't improve outcomes in terms of impact, and they worsen cost effectiveness. The last thing that we should think about here is sustainability, and this is one of the major arguments that people have put forward. Everything I've told you about so far is really impacts within the first 2 years of construction. We've been following them well since then, so this is like a sneak preview of work in progress. We're only at sort of year 6 or 7. You can see that the labor contribution wells do have a slightly higher survival rate, but the impact is really minimal. Maybe something's going to happen at years 10 and over. I'll have to keep you posted on that. So sorry for running over time, and thanks.
We should wait. Okay, I'm just thinking it makes sense that maybe not doing nothing at all is preferable, because it's not a public good, right? It's a private good. I mean, there's not really an externality from the fact that I don't have a wells on my neighbors. So you're not seeking contributions toward a collective public good. It's actually a private good. It's a private water connection. So maybe that's the reason why no contribution is better than any form of collective contribution.
But they are public goods. I mean, they're potentially public goods. There's like an institutional question whether they're public goods. But the idea is that you build one well, and if you asked engineers 20 years ago when they started building these wells, they were supposed to serve 200 households. I think that's a little unrealistic. I think our data suggests that it's more like, ends up being more like 20 households. But so they do have a public good component. But in a way, I think the reverse argument applies, right? Theoretically, screening should work less well for public goods than private goods. So, okay.
Okay, I think we're unfortunately out of time for this one. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thanks.
Next up, we have Arturo Adilo Gomez. Arturo is a lead transport economist in the Middle East and Northern Africa region at the World Bank. Until recently, he was the global lead for urban mobility in the World Bank's Transport Global Unit. He oversees a portfolio of transport projects, primarily in Egypt, and he also provides technical guidance on projects in other regions on issues such as financing, fare collection, the political economy of reform, and the role of disruptive technologies. He is an author of several peer-reviewed articles and 2 books, and holds a doctorate in urban transportation planning and a master in city planning from MIT. He also has a background as a civil engineer with a master's in economics from Los Andes University in Bogota. Floor is yours.
Thank you, I hope my presentation, what do I need to do? Press some button? Just wait. Have faith, okay. So I happen to be from Colombia, the country, not the university, right now seeing some riots, with an O, by the way. But this activity is financed by the World Bank, and it's part of, it's an analytical activity titled Low Carbon Mobility and Efficient Urban Form, which has a chapter on financing, and we promised at the concept note to look at Bogota precisely, not because I'm from Bogota, but because Bogota has extensive experience in one land value capture mechanism, which is the betterment levy or valorization. It's a word from Spanish that has permeated the literature. And indeed, so the objective is to extract lessons for other cities, given the long tradition, not only in Bogota, but also in Colombia, albeit we look also only at Bogota, 5 mini case studies. And here are the years of the case studies, and we try to extract lessons for other countries. First, a quick literature review. The fundamental, and Anna referred to it indirectly, it's if you benefit, you pay. The government builds an arterial road, an urban road, so therefore you should contribute to the financing of the construction because you benefited. There is extensive literature on the promises of land value capture, and I emphasize the word promises. We'll see, I'm placing in context that idea that the promise is one thing and the delivery is another. And there's also the idea in the literature that because land value capture is earmarked, that it should be favored over other instruments. I will explain what is the conclusion for other cities in light of this. Now, the property tax, as a tax, contrary to a levy, the tax is not earmarked. And this is why one reason in the TOD and land value capture literature, the authors don't like the property tax as much. But we will see what the Bogota story tells us. This research looks at the other revenue sources in Bogota, not only at the value capture. And in this way, we think we complement the literature because the literature focuses too much on one instrument, the land value capture. And there are pieces for Bogota with the metro, the first line, that promise that using only land value capture, it would be possible to finance an entire metro line. I doubt it very much, and I can explain in the Q&A. So the Colombian legal framework very quickly started in 1921, and gradually, at the time Congress legislated almost city by city, authorized first the Bogota, the national capital, the state capitals, and then eventually all the country. Luckily, Colombia doesn't legislate that like that anymore. Now it's a I call it the one size fits all, but at least it's one size that fits all the country. Whatever is now happens for one city, all cities are allowed, not that gradual approach. And here is something that the literature in English loves. The statistics in the second point. Oh, Bogota, 27.7% of the revenue in 1980 and so on. And they stick to these numbers, but they don't look again what happened after the evolution. And here is the promise again on land value capture. And don't take me wrong, there is a role for land value capture, and Bogota's case shows it. Now, the national law says each city must have its own city law. I call it a city law. It's an ordinance in the US terminology. It's not in the Colombian way, so let's call it city law. And says the Institute for Urban Development, Institute, IDU, is the one in charge, must present a program of works to the city council, and the city council must approve it. There is an oversight board that in theory gets elected people, and also says who are the beneficiaries that should pay. By the way, the Colombian law allows two ways to measure the benefits. One is you do a sample of where you have the intervention, a sample where you don't. You compare the prices and you say there was clearly an increase in value. The other approach is you say the government is building a road that costs 100, I need to recover 100. So let me charge 100. And I don't have to prove it because the law says you can use the one or the other. And Bogota follows the one costs 100, I need to recover 100. Let me spread the costs around and play with the formula. And Colombia likes citizen participation, and with the 1991 Constitution, we have even more citizen participation. So already the 1987 city law said citizens can participate, citizens can complain, citizens can kick the board and say, I don't want to be charged, etc., etc., etc. But the 1991 Constitution gave even more rights, more opportunities to complain. Apologies for the font. Focus on the right-hand two columns. Colombian peso, 4,000 pesitos or pesos for $1. Our numbers are huge. Moreover, $1 billion in pesos is not $1 billion in dollars, like the French, I think. Maybe? I don't know. So if I were to use billions, trillions, quadrillions, nobody will understand the paper. Therefore, the numbers in pesos appear with all the digits, including cents. Then the rightmost column has the amount in dollars at the day of approval of the city law with the amount for the valorization. So the numbers are big. In particular, there is one that is well, the numbers are small. Anyhow, is a timeline of the mayors of Bogota and the programs. So let's get into the first one. 1995, Antanas Mockus is the mayor, and he has one, he had two actually. The first bullet refers to the first one and the second to the other one. Bogota is known for having very wide arterial roads. Arterial roads can be from 40 to 100 meters, even some are 120 meters wide, the right of way. In fact, at some point, the median had soccer fields. Now they have a bus rapid transit system. But at one point, Bogota had medians with soccer fields because the right of way was huge. So this program widened a series of roads. The map shows Bogota and where the roads are located. The main problem in this instance was that the 1987 city law did not require beyond a concept note. So the city council approved a concept note, and costs went up once the final designs were ready, once the construction happened, once safeguards were met. And then in 1998, a different mayor said, IDU, of the increasing cost now that you have the final construction level designs, you can only charge 30% of that difference to the citizens. So the citizens received another invoice from IDU, another receipt to pay. By the way, IDU is the one that issues the receipt for the collection of the task. And then Peñalosa amended the law went to the city council as the new mayor and said, if you don't start by January 1st, 1999, so the works were approved in 1995, and by 1998, many were still not even contracted, not designed, because the law did not require to have designs. So it says, IDU, to motivate you, if you don't start by this date, you have to return the money to the taxpayers. And it has happened many times in Bogota's history. This is the largest ever valorization program in Bogota. It had 4 phases, and let me try to play the role of the head of IDU or the mayor of Bogota explaining, and many people here have PhDs. Assume you have barely high school education. Has 4 phases, and it's the largest ever, so the literature in English in particular loves this one. Almost $1 billion, fantastic. Please overlap the 2 maps with Grupo 1 and Grupo 2, phase 1, phase 2, I'll explain what the groups are, and you get basically 100% of Bogota, and there were 2 other phases, 3 and 4. So the idea was that phase 1 designed the works in phase 1, plus the works in phase 2, and built the works in phase 1. Vivian, your face says it all. Now, imagine that people then said, wait, I already paid in 2005. And they do, and the mayor said, oh, no, you paid for group 1 and phase 1, and the design of phase 2. Now you need to pay for group 2. But wait, the maps overlap, and you get 100% of Bogota. So not surprising, here is all the different projects, footbridges, roads, overpasses, sidewalks, parks. No mass transit. Conspicuously absent is bus rapid transit, metro lines, maybe in the Q&A. But it happened that in parallel, this mayor, the Colombian Lula da Silva from Brazil, the president, this was Luis Eduardo Garzón. He came from the workers' union tradition. He made it to mayor of Bogota. And he was trying to update the cadastre and the property tax. So people started using the right to kick the blackboard, to complain. And over 50,000. I know I should say this is 50,000 divided by the population at the time, benefited and so on. It doesn't matter because the mayor pays attention to how many complaints they do is receiving, regardless of an indicator normalizing it by area, by people, by beneficiary, no. So the mayor chose to drop the update of the cadastre and the property tax. I think it was a mistake. I'll show some numbers. I cannot prove that hypothesis. However, to allow the largest valorization program ever to go ahead, the mayor had to kill the upgrade of the cadastre and the property tax. By the way, a World Bank project 5 years later updated Bogota's cadastre, the Bogota Urban Services, and now Bogota has a world-class cadastre. Bear that in mind because it's an important fact. In 2010, another one, the Bogota famous 100-meter right-of-way, 60-meter right-of-way, and Bogota is one of the most congested cities in the world. I still don't get it. But anyhow, this program, it's in the orange part of the city, much wealthier. It's one of the wealthy areas of Bogota. So this mayor begins to pick up a pattern. Wait, the previous mayor went citywide, included all income groups, arguing we want to be inclusive. We want to benefit everyone, and we want to tax everyone, to levy a levy on everyone. This other mayor, now deceased, he ended up in jail for, anyway, corruption, said only the wealthy will pay. However, he found another way, because Colombian law, in the Constitution, by the way, now has the betterment levy and others, and said, well, if we're going to urbanize this area, they were urbanizing, developing, so said, well, maybe we allow higher density, and you pay with recovery for the roads, for the water, etc. And Colombia no longer uses, by the way, valorization for water facilities because the tariff system includes the construction of the financing the construction of the new one. 2013 program really amends the 2001, adds some roads, etc. And construction is still happening. If you go to the EDU website, you will find that some of the works promised in 2005 are still happening. And this 2013 program said, look, let's forget the footbridge, the sidewalks, and phases 3 and 4. They focused on phases 1 and 2, and they said, we will add other sources of revenue because the valorization, the betterment levy was not enough. And this program mandates to return a lot of the revenue raised because the works were not built or they were built late. So the actual revenue of the almost $1 billion was about 26%. And a lot, they do have to return with interest, by the way. Colombian law mandates with interest. Now, the 2018 program, Enrique Peñalosa, he's famous internationally as one of the mayors that transformed Bogota, that created the bus rapid transit system, that also promoted good sidewalks, bike paths, etc. And he has only 4 axes and the wealthy. Again, like the previous one, it focuses on the wealthy. And that is important because, as Peñalosa told me in the fieldwork I did for this piece, the wealthy can pay. You mentioned it, Anna. The wealthy actually can pay. And Bogota has a standard that is citywide for complete streets. So the sidewalks and the streets look the same everywhere in the city. The new ones, when they get upgraded or they're new, they look the same because it's a city law with the standards that the roads and sidewalks must meet. Somebody count how many manholes and different things you see on the sidewalk. And the next picture, similar. Pictures are mine, by the way. So this program has received 7,000 complaints. Again, it's in the thousands, but there has been no effort to, like in the 2005, to say, I don't want to pay, remove it. I don't want to pay. Here, the wealthy are saying, well, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the payment, the pocket hurts, but I'll pay, give me. And the law says you can pay in up to 5 years. As always, there were only conceptual designs when the council approved. So when Peñalosa left office on December 31st, 2019, there were only 2 of the many works contracted out. The others, the next mayor, Claudia Lopez, had to implement. And you see the quote there from one of my sources. It's one of the heads of the EDU. Upgrading sidewalks is more complex than building a metro line. And Bogota is building the first metro line and is, with World Bank support, hopefully financing a second one and construction will start soon. Let us hope. But the quote refers above all to several issues. One, when the city council approved, there was no detailed design. There was a mandate to coordinate with the utility companies. And there are myriad utilities on the sidewalks. Each box of those represents a different utility. So putting the neighbors to agree, asking them to agree on the design of a world-class sidewalk, meaning world-class, meaning that people can walk without tripping, because before in Bogota you had sidewalks, each owner built its own sidewalk, no? So one built it like here, the other one here, they loved the steps, people kept falling. At least now they're flat wherever possible, but it's more difficult than a metro. So Claudia Lopez, she ended her term last December, changed the law, said the 1987 law goes away and says what is underlined there. Now valorization is only after construction has started or is complete even. And therefore, there has to be detailed designs. There has to be, the new law says, the water company, the utility company, they have to agree before starting construction. And that's the incentive to say you can only charge the valorization levy if construction has started. And by the way, the law says we will have everybody's email Bogota is good at collecting data, and we will inform you via email. So we don't need those citizen participation mechanisms. Sorry? So let me now switch to the evolution of the tax revenue in Bogota. You see there, the top line is the sales tax. It's not the value-added tax, okay? The other one, the second one, is the property tax. As you can see, in public finance, we call them very dynamic taxes. The revenue is growing over time. This is in constant pesos of 2022. All throughout the series is in constant pesos of 2022. And I want you to look at the y-axis and focus on this, the 1,000. It's 1 billion, trillion pesos, whatever it is, it's the 1,000. And you see the fuel tax and other taxes that are not very dynamic. But pay attention to the 1,000 marker on the y-axis, because now I will present the same value, pesos, constant pesos of the same year as the previous chart. And here the y-axis gets to 800. Doesn't even touch the 1,000. Let me go back. Here, the bottom one, the valorization is always in the bottom part. That doesn't mean it's not significant. You see some jumps. And I want to highlight the 2018, the last program under Peñalosa, taxed the wealthy, and the wealthy paid. So you see the big jump. The 2005 promised heaven and earth, 4 phases, 4 groups, etc., etc. The literature picks this up, but the revenue was not that significant, and a lot of the revenue per judicial order and per city council order went back to the taxpayers. The orange line is Bogota's experiment with congestion pricing. The jury is out, but it's beginning to look like an interesting, and the projections by the city government are that it will reach in 2 years the 1,000 mark in the chart. So the conclusions. We have to understand that if you benefit, you pay principle, meaning don't expect this value capture to finance 100%. It can contribute. It has contributed in Bogota to financing a lot of roads, a lot of arterials, but it has never financed 100%, even though the city government told the city council, I promise you, I will build the roads with this revenue. It never happened. It needed other sources like the property tax. And key in this effort is to have a good data to identify who is the beneficiary and if the beneficiary can pay. Affordability is critical. The difference between the 2005 approach that covered almost all city and call it inclusive was that it taxed many people for whom this additional $50 were meaningful, or $100. They were meaningful, like they say, I will not pay, I will not pay. I can barely pay the property tax, I will not pay. So affordability, and there are ways, and here's where it links with the other part of this research, the low carbon mobility and efficient urban form, where we analyze that by allowing higher densities, by requiring less front yard, etc., you can end up with higher density, more built-up area, and the built-up area multiplied by whatever fee gives you revenue, whether it's the property tax, whether it's the betterment levy. If you allow more construction, more supply of built space, you are better off, and you might actually end up lowering the cost, making it more affordable. So measuring ability to pay. And then the sidewalks are so difficult, more difficult than a metro, because people identify that they paid the fee, the valorization levy, sorry, and therefore they think they have a bigger right to participate. The IDU head told me, when we upgrade sidewalks in other parts of the city that are financed by the general tax revenue, we don't have as much citizen participation. These earmarked mechanisms in the case of Bogota place a magnifying glass. The community mobilizes more actively, says, I paid for this sidewalk. I want a voice in the design. So And finally, the congestion charging scheme, also earmarked, quietly earmarked, but it's beginning to raise. And if you benefit, you pay. Calls for financing with many different sources. And I have a book on that, Sustainable Urban Transport Financing from the Sidewalks to the Subway, where we explain the financing mechanism. Thank you. Questions now?
Thank you, Arturo. I'll open the floor for questions. You have in the back.
Yes, I can at least.
And you rightly identified things that can be taken from Bogota's experience. In your practical judgment, when you come to other cities, what are the key bottlenecks that in other cities that prevent these best practices to be translated? Meaning, why other cities don't follow, Bogota's experience? Not only in Colombia but also in other developing countries that you worked on. What are the if you were to call like 3 major bottlenecks that prevent them to valorization, what those would be?
But the first one is to have the legal framework nationally and at the city level. Colombia is a unitary country. So the legal framework exists, and it has the second point, it has the flexibility to allow each municipality to tailor how it levies the valorization locally. So the local needs, so the national law gives a lot of flexibility in this case. And the third one is the cadastre. The cadastre is key to know who owns what are the characteristics, and therefore allows you to raise more revenue from the property tax. And Bogota has, as I said, thanks to a World Bank loan, a world-class cadastre. Does not envy anything vis-a-vis the Washington, D.C. cadastre. And you saw the figures. Actually, in that chart I showed, if you go compare Bogota in 2022, is able to collect 2.7 times in real terms what it was able to collect in the year 2000 from each taxpayer of the property tax, 2.7 times. So the database serves you for land value capture and serves you for the property tax. Those are the 3. Thank you.
Thanks, Arturo. Really interesting. I'm just trying to get the takeaway from this. It seems to me that as long as you have a good cadastre and it's updated in a precise way, not just like a general way of property inflation, but a way that reflects local neighborhood changes in property values, that seems much more practical on the one hand, less transaction cost, less complexity, and also more equitable because the property value will reflect ability to pay. Is that where you want to leave us, or have I got it wrong?
You got it absolutely right, and hence why I argued that it's important to look at the other revenue and how the property tax and the sale tax are so dynamic. So yes, Bogota is now able to afford metro lines, and before it could barely finance bus rapid transit on a shoestring. So Bogota has become wealthier and is able to tax its citizens much more and deliver. However, the valorization levy does play a role because the wealthy people, in this case, as the last 2 cases showed, can pay a little more, which frees up resources to build the exact same standard in poorer areas. And as Peñalosa told me, Bogota is a redistribution engine of income. Bogota is good at redistributing because of among other, these ideas. But you got it right, the property tax is central and captures value recurrently, every year, forever.
Thank you, Arturo. Let's give him a hand. Thank you, Arturo. Last but certainly not least, we have Jeff Dahlman. Jeff is a senior PPP specialist at the World Bank, and he brings a wealth of experience having advised government sponsors and lenders on infrastructure, finance, PPPs, and construction in just about every corner of the globe. He's an author of 14 books and numerous articles and blogs. And beyond the bank, Jeff is an adjunct professor at the Singapore Management University, and he lectures at the National University of Singapore as well. He's a qualified mediator and member of the International Advisory Panel of the Climate Impact Exchange. He's also leading a new World Bank initiative called the Emissions Reductions Program that helps developing countries to engage strategically with the global carbon market. Take it away.
Awesome, thank you very much. It's good to write your own bio, isn't it? You get to hear all those nice things about yourself. Good afternoon, everyone. Are you guys okay? I'm jet lag starting to hit me and there's been no coffee yet. So I'm going to try to stay awake. And fortunately, after two fantastic presentations, we have very little time left, so I get to go really fast, which is awesome. Do we have, yes, fantastic. So let me tell you a little bit about some work we've been doing, which I get really excited about. Hopefully you will find it equally interesting. Thinking about how we fund infrastructure. So we're talking lots about financing, but financing is just bringing forward tomorrow's revenues, right? So where are those revenues coming from? Where's that funding coming from? And we tend to, and I totally fall into this category, I look at a project, I say, all right, how much can the users pay? Great. Now, if the users can't pay, or if it's not affordable or whatever, then government's going to pay the rest. And that's sort of the typical approach even when you're looking at private financing, get the users to pay, get government to pay. And that vastly short sells the opportunities around infrastructure. So we've just heard fantastic presentation on land value capture. When we build infrastructure, the land that benefits from the infrastructure goes up in value. So why do the landowners get this massive windfall? Why do they get all the money? Why isn't that shared back? And which is the whole principle behind a lot of this valorization and property taxes. But a lot of our countries, the property tax systems don't work very well. So there's a lot we can do to improve those property taxes, which is great. Getting a proper cadastre, which most of the places I work, they have no idea what that means, much less have one in place. So how do you know how do you get that value back to pay for the infrastructure that creates the value? So land value capture is super important, but that's not the only thing that infrastructure does. Infrastructure creates huge commercial opportunities. And the private sector will come in quite happily on the back of all the money that the government spends to build infrastructure and make a lot of money off of commercial activities. And which is great. We're not begrudging the private sector making lots of money, but is there a way to capture some of that value again? And yes, you have corporate taxes and income taxes, and those things are more or less efficient at moving some full upside captured by the private sector. Shouldn't it be shared? Now, is that kind of money-grubbing greedy? Are we grabbing money away from people? Actually, what we're saying is, let's think about these things in advance so that as we develop our project, we are creating opportunities. So now not just the private sector is going to come in and on an opportunistic basis make money. We are creating the space for them to make more money. We're working with them in advance so that when our project comes through, the value they can create on the commercial side is much more interesting. And again, in the idea that we share that upside, share that windfall. And is it just about money? Of course not. It's about economic growth. It's about jobs. It's about all those great things that those commercial and economic opportunities create. So what do we do with that? And why is it that we don't think about this consistently when we develop infrastructure? We do that on a piecemeal basis. We do that where somebody creative is in the project and decides to look at these issues in advance. But often by the time we get to the project, it's way down the line. We've closed off a lot of the opportunities we would have, and we've missed out on some of these opportunities. So we start thinking about how do we do this? How do we incentivize government in the very early days of planning projects to think about not just land value capture, super important, and that should definitely be part of that, but also commercial value capture. How do we embed these commercial principles and that thinking into the project? And we started playing with guidelines and follow these steps and all those kind of things. But what we came out with, and again, would love your views on this, is basically a menu. Here are 100 different ideas that people all over the world have used to develop projects and to bring out these commercial opportunities. We did little project summaries. We got 60 of them, or 65. And just random examples from all over the world of cool stuff that people have done to try to inspire government planners and policymakers and infrastructure departments to look at these issues. Now, this is tricky, right? It sounds pretty straightforward, but it's really tricky for your average infrastructure engineer. Their job, let's talk about rail, because we're going to talk about Thai rail in a second. Let's talk about LRTs. If I'm in the Ministry of Transport and my job is to build an LRT, what do? I build my LRT, I focus on trains, I focus on civil works, I focus on getting the land, building the train, let's go. What communities are we going to connect? How's that going to work? I don't tend to think about these larger contexts. That's not my job, that's somebody else's job. And they are often not in the same conversation. And so how do we open up our minds to what we can do? And let me run down just a couple of these, because they're obvious things, and they're ones that we often do, but not consistently. So advertising and marketing. And you often see little adverts in the metro or in the bus terminal or whatever it might be. How consistently are you approaching that advertising? You also don't want the crazy Piccadilly Circus style overwhelms you with the level of advertising. So how do you find the right balance with the right engagement to bring out the value that you can get out of advertising? I live in Singapore. I'm based in the Singapore office. Singapore is fantastic at these things. When Singapore does their metro, they've got the Land Transport Authority, they've got the Urban Redevelopment Agency. The two of them work together hand in glove. That was only after years of fighting, years of stepping on each other's toes. But they've now learned how to work together to maximize the value for the state out of these kind of projects. They do studies well in advance of building out. They just extended out the metro, and they did comprehensive studies with private sector marketing and advertising advisors to help them identify where they can do this advertising. And the revenues they're getting from this are in the tens of millions a year. I mean, it's a significant amount of money. And when you see it in practice, the advertising is not overwhelming, it's not obnoxious. They do it really well, but because they planned it in advance. Obviously, parking is a huge one. And that, again, releases some of our congestion issues, provides us a lot of opportunities for services within, especially in a congested urban context. Can you use the space that you've got, either below ground or above ground, to create more public parking? Can you use that space more efficiently and more effectively? Retail emission reduction credits. And as he mentioned before, we're doing a lot of stuff in Singapore around carbon credits. And I know it's just a little thin slice of revenue, and we like to overplay how much this is going to be for our projects. But it's a really important piece to this overall structure. It's a really important opportunity to bring in, and not just for releasing revenues from carbon credits, but also for sustainable financing, for ticking boxes for equity investors, make your project much more exciting, because you have to meet all the criteria to make your project validly green in order to issue those carbon credits. So all of those co-benefits that you can get from focusing on these issues. So the kind of real example that I want to talk about quickly today is light rail trains, metros, monorails, all the different variations. This is a great opportunity in and around urban transport to develop out these commercial opportunities. And this is some of the material from Arturo and some of our colleagues. Gerald, exactly, I pinched this out of his book. So all this really cool stuff that we've got in the bank that we do know a lot about. Now, how do we bring that out? And we actually started this conversation, at least in this piece, in Thailand. We were doing work with the Thai cities. Now, those of you who don't know Bangkok, Thailand, Bangkok is the big city. 60 to 70% of economic growth comes out of Bangkok. So Thailand is desperate to expand out and develop its secondary cities. How do we get these secondary cities to move forward? And so we spend about 1.5 years working with them on attracting infrastructure finance, private sector investment, talk to them about PPPs, talk to them about carbon credits, talk to them about all kinds of different dynamics, and talk to them a little bit about these commercial revenues around infrastructure projects. They came back to us and said, this is fantastic, so exciting. We've got these light rail projects that the central government wants to do in our secondary cities. They built out a metro in Bangkok. They now want to roll this out in the secondary cities. But the Ministry of Transport is coming out, wants to build its rail, and that's that. And the cities wanted to use this opportunity to change the dynamic in the city, to use that light rail to change not just the locations of the stations, but all along the corridor, to try to not just land value capture, which is definitely on their list, but also to look at this as a way of changing the dynamic of the city, to build up in and around the stations, to do more aggressive planning within the city, to change the nature of those cities. But they didn't know how to work with central government. And central government didn't know how to work with the cities because they didn't have that history. And so we've started working with them on a program, bringing together central and local government, to bring together the transport and urban development and Ministry of Finance. And how do you bring all these different players around the same space in order to develop out these LRTs, bring more value and more revenue into the cities at the same time, but also help the cities access the capital that they need to contribute to these LRTs. And it was interesting when you were talking about getting communities to engage. It's the same thing between central and local government. Central government feels much more comfortable if local government puts money on the table and is involved in the project. Central government also doesn't want local government involved in the project. Central government wants to control the project, right? We want their money, but we don't really want them involved. But you miss a huge opportunity in these kind of projects if you don't bring local government into the kitchen. And so we're looking at 4 different cities as part of this project, and as the Thai like to call it, a sandbox. Let's all play in the sandbox and let's look at these different options and think of different ways to address the needs. And so we've chosen 4 cities with very different contexts and helping them walk through the process of looking at what it would take to finance and to deliver these LRT projects, how the city can build around the LRT projects, what they call TOD. It's a broader spectrum than classic TOD, but TOD options and solutions, which is very much commercial opportunities in and around the stations. So one of them is Pattaya, which is a town just on the coast outside of Bangkok. Pattaya has a very unique history. I won't go into here because it's a little spicy, but it's a very interesting beach resort where people from Bangkok will go for the weekend, traditionally. Thailand is building a high-speed rail project. I say is building. They've been building this for a few years now. The financing is just about there, but there's a lot of hope that in the next 6 months this project gets going. So if this high-speed rail project happens, you have linkages from Bangkok around Pattaya and down the coast. And so Pattaya would now be a half an hour from downtown Bangkok. This changes the face of Pattaya potentially. This gives them the opportunity to become a satellite suburb of Bangkok. In fact, you're better off living in Pattaya to get to downtown Bangkok than you are to live in Bangkok because the congestion is horrible. So what do we do with this? The city, as it links in with the high-speed rail, they want to create an LRT that would link the high-speed rail station into the center of the city, and looking at developing different TOD opportunities in and around those stations. In a kind of a similar, and here you can see this high-speed rail that goes to Pattaya up on the top left and down through the bottom, down to Rayong City. Rayong City, another coastal city, but very industrial, right near the port zone. It's a great place to do business, not a great place to live. And so they want to change the face of Rayong City. They want to create a connector from Rayong City to the high-speed rail and also redevelop a space in the center of town. And how to do that in a way that brings in these commercial investments and commercial opportunities. The third one is Phuket. Anyone been to Phuket? You can tell this is a really horrible project for us to be working on because we have to go to all these terrible places. Phuket's this beautiful tourist resort on an island. The airport is at the north end of the island. The tourist areas are the south west side, and the southeast is the main city where the people live. And there's a range of mountains that goes down the middle. So they're building out a light rail train that goes from the airport down to the main city, and then a gondola project that will go up over the mountains. And why a gondola? Not just because the tourists will love it, but because it's minimal footprint on the mountain range. And so you don't have to drill through it, you don't have to dig roads around it. But by creating this movement, you could bring people in from the airport, allow them better access to the main city, but also allow the locals to get access to their jobs without having to get around the mountain and go through horrible congestion. And then the fourth one is in Konkan, and a completely different model. This one is very private sector driven. And this one, the private industrials in the city, and this is a big university city just north of Bangkok, has 9 different universities, huge influx of students into the city, so very seasonal variation in traffic. And here the local industrials, because there's a lot of high-tech industrials there, they wanted to build this out, not just for congestion, but also to demonstrate their ability to deliver local rolling stock, et cetera. And so there it's driven by the city without the central government. And so do we have a model where they're looking at land value capture, they're looking at commercial value TOD to bring in all of the revenues necessary for the project? Our analysis so far, I completely agree with you, this is not going to fly on a purely commercial basis, even with land value capture. So how do we, again, feed in the central government funding in order to allow the freedom of the local government to deliver on the commercial developmental side while still meeting the central government's needs on transport side? So let me give you just a couple thoughts and the things that central government is really struggling with. One is the inability of local and central government to work together. And I know we run across this in all of our different countries. So difficult to get them in the same room, talking the same language, understanding the same issues. Central government wants to be in charge. Local government desperately wants to be in charge and is frustrated with central government looking over their shoulders. How do we create a platform, a governance structure that allows the two players to work together and saving face? Second is coordination between the urban development planning and the transport side. And very tricky. Each has a different focus, a different agenda, and yet the two desperately need to work together. And the sum of the parts will be much greater. So how do we help them work together? And it's been fascinating, even in central government between transport, finance, and Ministry of the Interior. When we call meetings, they're so excited because all those people will show up in the room. Normally, they wouldn't be allowed to call each other into a meeting for various political and positioning reasons. But when it's the World Bank that calls them together, so can we play that part of the intermediary that brings me the safe space for people to have these conversations? But how do we embed that in the system so that we're not needed going forward, so this becomes a natural part of their engagement? And the last one is also a tricky one. Using public land and public space for public services for commercial purposes. Now, every country wrestles with this. Different countries address this in different ways. But we're picking through how the Thai government reacts to this concept, how we can make a space that allows them to do this without violating their fundamental sense of what is public service, what government should appropriately be doing, not squeezing out the private sector, not replacing them, but empowering them and enabling them and working together with the private sector. And that's been a super interesting sort of finding the right balance in the midst of this. Very interesting context. Anyway, sorry, I've taken way too much time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think we're on the hour, but we have maybe time for a couple questions. Yeah, exactly. Danielle?
Thank you. Arturo, you mentioned that, if I understand correctly, Colombians, people in Bogotá are getting richer, so taxation can be increased, right? So, and maybe Ronald can correct me, but I remember in Chile, toll road rates has been increased on real term, assuming that future generation will be richer, so they can contribute more. So is there any discussion on intergenerational equity and also on gentrification, right? Because even so when you look at the red line in Washington, right? So you see the population living to the planet station and the population living today is quite different, right? So just some thinking on intergenerational equity and gentrification.
In my research in Colombia and Bogota didn't come the intergenerational equity. The property tax rate oscillates a little bit year by year. The city council defines it. That's the most it goes, but Peñalosa was very clear that Bogota redistributes a lot of income towards the from the wealthy to the needy, and has the same standard. On the next one, on the other question. No, I'm done.
Thank you.
Vivian? And Ben, did you have a question after? Okay. Vivian and then Ben.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is for Jeff. I was wondering if you have a feeling on this commercial value capture, what sort of percentage of either the operating costs or the debt service can one aspire to potentially capture through these innovative approaches?
Yes. I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because as part of this process, you want to inspire and create vision and get people excited. But as soon as you start putting numbers out there, you create expectations that are, hugely exaggerated from what they could be. That said, for instance, we went and visited in Japan. They've got a really fantastic program. They bring all the private sector players together. They do it all consensually. And of course, Japan's a different context, but the upside is huge. I mean, there's some really, really interesting potential, but I would be really loath to put numbers against it because it depends on the context, the city, how far you're able to go, the footprint, how much space you're able to get, who owns the land and where the land is. In Konkan, the land belongs to government, so there's huge flexibility and there's a lot of upside potential. In a lot of the other places, it's a little bit about revenues. It's more about bringing the private sector together to invest in the next phase of the city. So there's almost more of an economic developmental focus than it is on real revenue generation. Sorry, that's a wimpy answer, but.
Okay, great, thanks. My question is also to Jeff, but maybe Arturo can also touch upon it. So I think it's great to talk about revenues to actually support infrastructure programs and through this innovative revenue program. I guess my question is kind of a political economy question and also an incentive question. So these revenues belong to others. So how do you get the right to collect and use this revenue for this purposes? So what has been the experience from a political economy point of view to actually allow different stakeholders seed that revenue for something else completely to use for this? I guess the second thing is kind of maybe touch upon Vivian's question as well. How confident would the private sector be to actually then start investing or buy bonds on the back of these revenues that are riddled with political economy and uncertainty? So I wonder if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. So on the first question, there are a lot of different models. So it depends on who owns the lands, who's doing what. You have, as the government, you have the ability to allow people to increase their FARs, to build up, to build out, to build down, and you can play with that to help people do more, but then you charge them for it, and you use that money to finance the infrastructure. In some cases, it's about bringing all the different players together in one zone. So you take all the private landowners, bring them together under one roof, and again, give them the right to build up, to build out, to give more, to link to the station, all that kind of stuff. And so you can take a piece of that because you're there, an intermediator, and helping them make it happen. You can also build under a station, over a station. There's some challenges with the box of the station, and you went to renew that before you renew the building and that kind of stuff. But in Singapore, when you have a metro station, you will go to very few metro stations that don't have a shopping mall or an apartment building or an office building on top. And they make a fortune. Hong Kong is another great example, right? But these are heavily dense. This is high land value. So you use those examples to help people get some ideas, but be very careful about what you promise because not many people can afford to build that kind of volume. But there are a lot of really interesting ways for government to get a piece of that, or for the private sector to contribute and to pay for part of what you're delivering, because they know they're going to make money. Now, the second question is, for me, one of the biggest challenges at the moment. So in Thailand, because this is a new program, what we'd love to do is say, let's build out the rail and the TOD at the same time, right? Because until you build out the rail, the TOD property isn't worth very much, all right? But you really want to, but if you build out the rail before the TOD, then the traffic is much less. So you need the TOD to drive the traffic of the rail, but you need the rail to drive the value of the TOD. In Japan, they do it all at the same time because everybody trusts the system and they know it's going to happen. It's been decades that they've been doing this. Can't do that in Thailand because Thailand, the government announces a program. Can you trust that that's going to happen and what the time frame will be? So we're looking at a couple different models. One is to create a city corporation that brings all of that underneath it, that we use development finance to pay for the rail, but you know that it's going to be a while, so there's going to be a settling in period, and so your revenues are going to be low, but you plan for that in advance, and you plan for the carry costs. The other is to have a kind of a PPP structure where you bring everything under one roof, and again, you're looking at that carry cost that gets built into the project, and you think about how you're going to develop this, but you keep the value in one place, and then maybe you can borrow against the property value because it has a future value. There are a bunch of different options. We don't have a gold standard, here's the way to go, but super interesting question.
So Ben, your question inspires what I mentioned, that in Bogota never has levied the betterment levy on mass transit. And Bogota has 112 kilometer BRT, never. I documented for the first 42 kilometers the political economy of the planning and implementation. In the over 300 consultations that the city held along the alignment, the most common question was, are you going to charge me valorization for this thing? No. Then let's talk about the design, let's talk about the benefits, but if you're going to charge me, I don't want it. Get away. So Peñalosa was not dumb and said, we will not, and therefore set the precedent. Now, Bogota is building a $6 billion metro line. It's for us, all of us, to pay in Colombia, not only in Bogota. 70% of the food bill of the bill, by the way, is footed by the national government. So all of Colombians are contributing, and under if you benefit, you pay. Now Bogota, and this has to do with Daniel's question, is getting denser and denser, and Bogota is following in its land use regulations, is more and more adopted a market-friendly approach, particularly with the floor area ratio, allowing higher and higher densities. And Bogota is one of the densest cities in the world, very suitable for putting a transit line almost anywhere.
Thank you, Arturo. Thank you, Jeff. Any final questions?
On observation, really, I noticed that the prices of, well, there have been studies that the prices of land and property go up after you build a rail line in Chile, at least. But it's interesting, regarding your point, that that doesn't happen when you put a bus transit line, and perhaps that explains your observation that they didn't want to pay.
No, there is research by Rodriguez and Targa. Targa now works at the World Bank. They were able to show that, and also Munoz Raskin, separate papers, also at the World Bank, they show that the prices increased in Bogota with the bus. The real estate, there is clearly an increase in the price around the bus rapid transit station because it's very high quality. It has been an improvement of facade to facade, sidewalks, carriageways, busways. So all the infrastructure gets upgraded, and the market is responding. Where the land use regulations don't allow higher densities, where people like Sivanides have documented a loss of welfare and of opportunities to benefit more people and to raise additional revenue. But the impact positive on prices is there.
Adding to that briefly, I think part of the difference there between bus and rail is the permanence of it and what the market expects, right? So I think BRT probably falls somewhere in between in those, but. Yeah.
And I'm thinking of BRT. BRT didn't have any effect, but subway did. That's the difference. Oh.
You guys have a world-class metro.
Yeah, that's perhaps a BRT isn't.
I wanted to ask about the BRT as it was built out, and you took out all those football pitches. Has that had any effect on Colombia's international football success, or?
Well, in 2014 we placed 5th in the World Cup. So yes, 2014 we placed 5th. So yes, positive impact.
Stefan, did you have any final words? Okay. Well, that's perfect. Coffee is served, I've been told. Thank you all for the questions and the participation, and one final applause for the thought-provoking speakers.